pleasure to be here today. You know, if there's one thing that we know about the technology that we use every day, is that it profoundly changes our behaviors. And so what I've done over the past several years is to look at these companies that tend to meet a certain pattern. See if you recognize a company that meets this description. It typically starts out as a toy, a nice-to-have, perhaps a feature of somebody else's product. And then in the span of 5 to 10 years, they're making hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars. And they're touching hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people's lives. Now, what companies come to mind? What do you think of? Twitter. What else? Apple. What else? More recent. Facebook. Of course, the $155 billion behemoth. What else? WhatsApp, right. $19 billion acquisition for that company. Right, it makes Instagram look cheap by comparison. Instagram was started by 12 people, 18 months, billion-dollar acquisition. So I've been looking over the past several years, what is it about these companies that allows them to very quickly fundamentally change users' day-to-day habits? And I've been looking for patterns of how technologies change behavior and change people's day-to-day lives. And I've been studying this phenomenon of habits. These behaviors that are done with little or no conscious thought. It turns out that about 50% of what you do day in and day out, whether you like it or not, is done with little or no conscious thought, purely out of habit. And I think that we're on the precipice of an age where we can use habits for good. And I'm not alone. There's an explosion of companies where I live in Silicon Valley and around the world that are using the psychology of habit design to help people live happier, healthier, more fulfilling, more connected lives. And that's what I want to help you do today. I'm going to share with you this pattern that I've found is endemic to habit-forming technologies. And I call this pattern the hook. Now, the hook is very simply an experience designed to connect your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. Connecting your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. And what we find is, through successive passes through these hooks, this is how habits are formed. This is how we begin to shape and form and create users' tastes and preferences. Now, these hooks have 4 parts. They start off with a trigger, an action, a reward, and an investment. And we see this pattern time and time again in habit-forming technologies. So normally, I have to give you a bit of a disclaimer. Normally, when I teach this course at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and at the Design School at Stanford, this is over several weeks, 3 weeks at a time, but I've got about 20 minutes. So this is going to be very, very condensed, so stick with me. The first step of this hook model is the trigger phase. Now, triggers come in 2 types, 2 flavors, if you will. They come in external triggers and internal triggers. Now, external triggers you'll be very familiar with, especially if you're a designer or product development or entrepreneur. If you work in technology, you know all about these external triggers. These are things that cue our next action, where the information for what to do next is contained in the trigger itself. So things like a button that says, play this, or click here, or tweet this, or share now, or a cop standing at the corner and telling you which direction to go, or your friend through word of mouth telling you about a great app you should really try. These are all examples of external triggers. The information is in the trigger itself. We know all about these things, right? But what designers don't think about enough are the internal triggers. Internal triggers are things that cue the next action, where the information for what to do next is contained through an association in the user's mind. Okay? And it turns out that what we do in response to being in a certain place, a situation, a routine, and most frequently, emotions, dictates our habits just as reliably as those external triggers. So what we do when we're feeling lonesome or indecisive or bored or stressed or dissatisfied or lost, what we do in response to these emotions can dictate our habits. The foundation of these habits are these internal triggers. And if you notice, these emotions are negative emotions. And it turns out that there's a lot of data that shows us that people will react in different ways in response to these negative emotions. And here's some of the science that proves this. We know that people who have clinical depression check email more. Now, why would that be? Why would people with clinical depression check email more? I was giving a workshop a few weeks ago, and somebody stood up in the back of the room and said, it's because email makes us depressed, which I could kind of get that. Sometimes I do feel like my inbox is overwhelming. But actually, what this study found was that people suffering from clinical depression experienced what psychologists call negative valence states. They felt down more frequently than the rest of the population. And so what were they doing to lift their mood? They were checking email. They were using the web differently and more frequently than the general population. And let's think about this in our own lives. What technology do we use when we're feeling lonely? Facebook, right? How about when we're unsure? Before we actually consider whether we know the answer, we go ahead and we Google it. And what about when we're feeling bored? Between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when you have that big project you need to work on that you really don't feel like working on, it's a great time to hop onto YouTube or check the news or stock scores or sports scores. Lots and lots of solutions for this internal trigger of boredom. Boredom doesn't feel good, and so we seek to get out of that negative valence state. So what do we do with this information? Right? Maybe it's a bit of pop psychology. Some of you might be considering how you use technology in your own life and what triggers your behaviors. But how do we build better products to help people knowing this information about the importance of internal triggers? Well, it comes down to, first and foremost, understanding what your user's itch really is. Understanding what is that internal trigger that you're forming an association with. Let's do a quick case study here. Let's think about Instagram and what made Instagram such a habit-forming product. How many of you use Instagram? A lot of people? OK, great. So let's think about it. What was the external trigger for Instagram? How did most people first find out about it? Well, there was Facebook, there was Twitter, there was word of mouth. And every time someone posted a photo from Instagram to these social networks, there was an explicit call to action. There was an external trigger telling the user what to do next. Let's think about for a moment about the internal triggers. Did you, sir, say you use Instagram? What was the last thing you took a picture of? Do you remember? Of me, OK. So I'm guessing, and what's your name? Adam. So I didn't tell Adam, take a picture of me with Instagram, did I? No, there was a moment in time that he wanted to capture, namely my talk, thank you very much. And the solution to capturing this moment in time, to holding on to it, was Instagram. Instagram scratches this itch of needing to hold on to the moment. And now, of course, Instagram is much more than just a way to capture the moment. Instagram is also a social network. So the more times users pass through this 4 steps of the hook, the more they begin to associate using Instagram with these other internal triggers, right? When they're feeling bored or seeking connection, or FOMO. What's FOMO? Fear of missing out, right? It's actually in the Merriam-Webster dictionary this year. Fear of missing out feels bad. We don't like the sensation that we might be missing out on something. And the solution to that discomfort, to that pain point, is Instagram. Instagram wins. So that's the trigger phase of the hook. Understanding your user's itch and figuring out the call to action, the external trigger that prompts them to action. Let's talk about that action, the action phase of the hook model. The action phase can be summarized as the simplest behavior in anticipation of a reward. The simplest behavior in anticipation of reward. Let me show you how simple I mean by simple. Something as simple as a scroll on Pinterest, or searching on Google, or the act of pushing the play button on YouTube. That's simple action in anticipation of reward. And it turns out that there's a formula to help us predict the likelihood of these singular behaviors. And this formula comes to us from B.J. Fogg, who's a researcher at Stanford. How many people have seen this before? A few folks? OK, good. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Fogg posits that for any human behavior, as represented by B, we need 3 things for this behavior to occur. This is online as well as offline. Doesn't matter. Any human behavior requires these 3 things: sufficient motivation, sufficient ability. Ability is how easy or difficult something is. And a trigger must be present. We talked about triggers. So let's talk about motivation for a minute. Motivation, according to Edward Deci, the father of self-determination theory, is the energy for action, how much we want to do something. And psychologists have been arguing about the nature of motivation for decades and decades, but I think Fogg gives us these 6 levers which are useful in a startup context. That when we think about how do we change user motivation, it really comes down to these 6 basic levers to increase or decrease motivation. That all human beings seek pleasure and avoid pain. We seek hope and avoid fear. We seek social acceptance and we avoid social rejection. So there's a lot more about motivation and all these concepts in my book, but that's just a quick overview of these 6 levers. Let's talk about ability for a minute. Ability is the capacity to do a particular behavior, how easy or difficult something is. And here again, we have these 6 factors, these 6 things which make a behavior more likely to occur by making it easier or more difficult to do. So how much time something takes, how much money is involved, how much physical effort is required. Brain cycles. Brain cycles is a big one in our industry when it comes to technology because it turns out the harder something is to understand, the less likely it is for that behavior to occur. Social deviance. We become more likely to do something when we see other people like us also doing it. And then finally, non-routine. Non-routine is an important factor, and it's why habits have a repeater effect. Because what we know is that the more we do a particular behavior, the easier it becomes, and therefore, as it becomes easier to do, we do it more frequently. What do we call that? What's that principle? It's called practice. So habits have this repeater effect. The more we do something, the easier it becomes, and therefore we become more likely to do it in the future. So Fogg puts these 3 factors together inside this graph that I think is actually very useful in a startup context. When we're building new products, we can ask ourselves, hey, why aren't users doing this specific action we've designed for them? And so we can ask ourselves, does the user have sufficient motivation? Do they have sufficient ability? If something is easy to do, it's way over here on the right. If something is hard to do, it's over here on the left. And if they do, they cross this threshold, this blue line, and if a trigger is present, the behavior will occur. Let's make this concrete. I want you to think about the last time a phone rang in your life and you didn't pick it up. What's a reason? Somebody give me a reason. Why didn't you pick up the call? Because I called and you didn't want to talk to me. Or a telemarketer or somebody you didn't want to talk to called you. So your motivation was too low. Okay? If you didn't want to talk to them, your motivation was too low. The phone was right there next to you. And you heard the call ring, so the trigger was present. What's another reason why you may not pick up a call? You're listening, you're in a meeting or you're in a conference and it's too socially awkward to take a call and walk out of the room. Your ability was too low. You had high motivation, but your ability was too low. What's one more reason that has to do with a trigger? It has to do with a trigger why you may not pick up a call. You didn't hear it. The phone was on silent. You really wanted to pick up the call, high motivation. The phone was right there next to you, high ability, but no trigger was present. I can't tell you how many times I'm called in for these expensive design reviews, and I see the UX, and I ask the team, where's the trigger? What do you want the user to do here? So having a clear trigger present must be there every single time to get the intended behavior. Sufficient motivation, ability, and a trigger every single behavior. The next step of the hook model is the reward phase. So after we've figured out the user's itch, We've designed the simplest action in anticipation of reward. Now it's time to scratch the user's itch, to give them what they came for, to give them the reward. Now, when we talk about rewards, we have to start in the brain. And in particular, an area of the brain studied by two Canadian researchers in the 1940s called the Nucleus accumbens. Now, Olds and Milner, these two researchers, discovered that when they provided a bit of stimulus, an electric current to this part of the brain in lab animals, all they wanted to do was to stimulate that part of the brain. They would have a little lever that they could push, and every time they pushed that lever, they would receive a tiny stimulus inside this part of their brain, and they would forgo food, water, they would run across electrified grids just to continue to experience that sensation. In later experiments, they observed the same type of behavior with people. They would incessantly click on this button to self-stimulate this part of the brain, the nucleus accumbens. But it turns out that you actually don't need electrical currents to stimulate this part of the brain. Other things also activate the nucleus accumbens. Luxury goods, sex, certain chemicals, junk food, and of course in the center, technology. All of these things stimulate the very same part of the brain, the nucleus accumbens. At the time, Olds and Milner and much of the psychology community thought that the purpose of the nucleus accumbens was to stimulate pleasure. Why else would lab animals incessantly click on this button? Why did they have to take these machines forcibly away from people if it wasn't because the sensation felt good? Well, it turns out that wasn't exactly the case. The job of the nucleus accumbens is not to stimulate pleasure, it's to stimulate the stress of desire, wanting, anticipation, craving. That turns out to be the role of the brain's reward system. Because the nucleus accumbens becomes active in anticipation of the reward. But when we receive the thing we think we want, the thing that's supposed to make us feel good, the object of desire, that part of the brain becomes less active. That's the itch that we seek to scratch, this anticipatory response, the craving, that idea of wanting to check your email whenever you think about it, whenever it comes to mind. That automatic response is stimulated from this itch. And it turns out that there is a way to supercharge that stress of desire. Is anybody curious how? Anybody want to know? Exactly. That's the point. That the unknown is fascinating. So when I asked you a question and I changed my cadence and I took that pause, I did something a little differently. And many of you perked up. What's he going to say next? What's going to happen? And it turns out that this variability, this bit of mystery, this intrigue, causes us to increase focus, engagement, and it's also highly habit-forming. Much of the research around the power of variability comes to us from B.F. Skinner, which many of you might remember from your first psychology courses, the father of operant conditioning. Skinner put these pigeons inside his famous boxes. He gave these pigeons a tiny disc to press on, and every time they pressed on this disc, they would receive a food pellet, a reward. And at first, the pigeons would click whenever they were hungry. But then Skinner did something a little different. He introduced variability. Sometimes the pigeons would click, nothing would come out. Sometimes the pigeons would click, and the reward would come out. And Skinner found that when there was a bit of variability, a bit of mystery, a bit of the unknown, the rate of response increased. The behavior was observed to occur more frequently. Why? Because we now know that the nucleus accumbens become stimulated with variability. And so in all sorts of products that we find most engaging, most habit-forming, the ones that capture our attention and won't let go, we find one or more of these variable reward types. Rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. Rewards of the tribe are about social rewards, things that feel good from other people and have this variable component. So empathetic joy, feeling good because someone else feels good. Partnerships, cooperation, competition, all examples of variable rewards. Of course, in technology, there's no better example than social media, Where on a site like Facebook, when Mark Zuckerberg got married, 1.3 million people liked it. Think about all the variability involved on a site like Facebook. What am I going to find when I open my news feed? What did people post? How many people liked it? What do the comments say? Very high degree of variability involved with what I might find using a social network. Stack Overflow. How many of you here use Stack Overflow? I'm guessing a lot of you, right? For those of you who don't use it, Stack Overflow is the world's largest technical question and answer site. 5,000 questions get answered every single day, and this is technical documentation. Why? Why do people do it? Well, what happens when you post your answer to Stack Overflow? What happens to your answer? It gets upvoted or downvoted. And every time it gets upvoted, you earn points. And these points translate into badges. But these badges aren't something that you just post on your wall for aesthetic reasons. These badges confer status in your community, the people whose opinions you care about, your fellow engineers. It's a form of social reinforcement that has this variable component. There's this bit of mystery involved. Next comes the search for resources, rewards of the hunt. Rewards of the hunt stem from our primal search for food and resources. And of course, today, these things are bought with money. So when we think about gambling, the variable reward is, of course, about money. That's what comes out of these machines. But what many people don't consider is that information can also be a form of variable reward. So the reward of the hunt can be demonstrated in the feed. Think about why the feed is so prevalent today. Why is it that every technology product seems to have this type of feed mechanism? Well, let's think about it. Let's look at Twitter. That first thing is not very interesting. The second thing is not very interesting. But oh, the third, that's interesting. And so if I want more, what do I have to do? I just scroll, right? So this becomes very similar to this. Both variable rewards of the hunt. This endless search, searching and searching and searching. Never done searching. Finally is the search for self-achievement, what I call rewards of the self. Rewards of the self are things that have an element of variability, feel good, but don't come from other people and aren't about these material or information rewards. So intrinsic motivators, things like mastery, competency, consistency, control, these are examples of rewards of the self. So if you think about gameplay, getting to the next level, the next accomplishment is all about this search for mastery and competency. And if you say to yourself, yeah, but I don't really play video games, that's not really for me, I bet you play this game every day. Checking that unread message, clearing your box, finishing your to-do list, checking that jewel icon on an app is all about this variable reward of the self. Mastery, consistency, competency, and control. Because the purpose of variable rewards is to scratch the user's itch, to give them what they came for, but leave them wanting more, right? Some type of element of mystery to keep them curious about what they might find the next time they engage. So we figured out the user's itch in the trigger phase. Then comes the simplest behavior in anticipation of reward, the action phase. Then comes the reward, and finally, the investment phase. Now, the investment phase is the part of the hook that I think most startups neglect. The investment phase is all about future rewards, not about immediate gratification. That's what the action phase is about. But the investment phase is about some kind of future reward. And the investment phase increases the likelihood of the next pass through the hook in two ways. Number one, investments load the next trigger. Investments load the next trigger. So when I send a message on WhatsApp, and by the way, this slide was in my deck way before the acquisition, but when I send a message on WhatsApp, I don't get anything. What happens? What's my immediate reward? Nothing. What I'm doing is investing in one of these, right? Every time I send a message, I become more likely to use this technology, this platform, because I'll get one of these. I've loaded the next trigger. That jewel icon from someone's reply brings me back into the app and takes me through these 4 steps of the hook again. That's the next external trigger. So that's the first thing that investments do. They load the next trigger. The second way investments increase the likelihood of the next pass is by storing value. You know, one of the reasons I love working in technology is because unlike things made of atoms, things in the physical world, like our computers and our phones and the chairs you're sitting on and everything that's made out of real things, these things depreciate, right? They lose value the more they're used. But habit-forming technology has the opportunity to appreciate, to become more valuable with use. And it does this through this principle of stored value. That the more content I add to a product like iTunes, the more valuable it becomes to me as my one and only music library. The more data I put into Mint.com or any other personal finance software, the more valuable the product becomes, the more data I put in, the more stored value in that product. Followers, the more followers I have, for instance, on a site like Twitter, the more valuable the product becomes as a way to reach my audience. So if Twitter sent out an email tomorrow and said, hey, guess what, we're going to start charging you for Twitter, who's more likely to send in the check? Someone with 10 followers or 10,000 followers? Of course, it's the person with 10,000 followers. The product becomes more valuable the more stored value in the form of followers that we accrue. And then finally, reputation. Now, reputation is a form of stored value that users can literally take to the bank. So the higher reputation I have on sites like TaskRabbit or eBay or Airbnb, the higher price I can sell my products and services. And how likely is it that a competitor can sweep in and take me away? Pretty unlikely, pretty tough to do, because I've spent all this time investing in my reputation. I've accrued all this stored value. So that's the 4 steps of the hook model, these experiences designed to connect your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. And through these hooks, done in series, this is how users' preferences and attitudes are shaped. This is how habits are formed with our technologies. Now, I need to apologize because that was a lot. I gave you a word of warning that was going to be a lot of information. So if you're a bit overwhelmed, the good news is that the organizers of this conference have bought 100 books that will be given out for free right at the break, and happy to sign those for you. It's also available on Amazon. But the 5 fundamental questions that you should be answering for yourself to ask whether your product has the potential to form habits is, number 1, what's the user's itch? What's the internal trigger that your product is addressing? Number 2, what's the external trigger that prompts the next action? Number 3, what's the simplest behavior done in anticipation of reward? Number 4, is the reward fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And then finally, what's the bit of work done to increase the likelihood of the next pass? Now, before I go, there's one more thing I want to talk about. The morality of manipulation. That we need to be honest with ourselves here, that designing habit-forming products is a form of user manipulation. And that the products that we're building, our technologies, are the ones that users are taking with them to bed every night. They're the first thing that people are reaching for before they even say good morning to their loved ones. And as Ian Bogo said, our technologies are quite possibly becoming the cigarettes of this century. So what responsibility do we as designers, as entrepreneurs, as investors have to shape people's lives using these technologies? Well, I think it's time to use the psychology of habit design for good. You know, problems is one thing that we have no shortage of. So I encourage you to use these tactics for good, to pick a problem that's worth tackling, help people find meaning and engage them in something important, and to build on the words of Gandhi, to build the change that you wish to see in the world. Thank you very much.